The morning sun cast long shadows across St. James's Park as Alexander Montgomery stood at the window of his newest restaurant, the Crown and Crescent. At 32, he had built an empire of high-end establishments across London. Yet something felt missing in his life of luxury and achievement. Running his fingers through his perfectly styled dark hair, he adjusted his bespoke suit and checked his Patek Philippe watch, another morning ritual of observing the park's early visitors. That's when he saw her again. Every morning at precisely 7:15 she would walk through the park, her copper-colored hair catching the sunlight like autumn leaves in motion. She always wore the same worn-out blue coat, carried a weathered messenger bag, and moved with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of whatever burdens she carried. Today, she stopped to share her morning pastry with an elderly man on a bench, a simple act of kindness that made Alexander's heart skip a beat. "Another profitable quarter, sir," announced James Harrison, his financial advisor, striding into the office with a stack of papers. "The new restaurant in Mayfair is exceeding all expectations." Alexander barely registered the words, his attention fixed on the young woman now helping a child retrieve a balloon caught in a tree branch. "Who is she, James?" "I beg your pardon, sir." "That girl in the park, the one with the copper hair. She passes by every morning. Same time, same route. Have you ever seen her enter any of the surrounding buildings? Perhaps she works nearby?" James adjusted his glasses and peered out the window. "I'm afraid I haven't noticed, sir." "Shall I have someone look into it?" Alexander shook his head, an idea forming in his mind. Throughout his life, his wealth had been both a blessing and a curse. Every relationship he'd attempted had been tainted by the shadow of his fortune, women more interested in his bank account than his character. But this mysterious woman, with her simple acts of kindness and apparent indifference to the opulent surroundings of St. James's, intrigued him in a way he couldn't explain. "Cancel my meetings for the next few weeks, James, and get me some different clothes. Nothing expensive, actually. Make them as worn and ordinary as possible." James's eyebrows shot up. "Sir, are you planning some sort of disguise?" "Something like that." Alexander smiled, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I want to understand her world, James, not as Alexander Montgomery, the restaurant tycoon, but as someone she might actually talk to, someone real." "With all due respect, sir, this seems rather unorthodox. What about the board meeting next week? The new restaurant opening in Chelsea? You can handle it. That's why I pay you the big bucks, isn't it?" Alexander's tone was light, but his determination was evident. "Sometimes, James, you have to step out of your comfort zone to find what you're really looking for." That evening, Alexander stayed late in his office, watching as the park emptied and the streetlights flickered to life. He thought about the mysterious woman, about her kindness to strangers, about the way she seemed to carry sunshine with her wherever she went. He had everything money could buy, yet he'd never felt the kind of genuine warmth she radiated so effortlessly. The next morning, he arrived at the park hours before his usual time, wearing clothes that would have horrified his tailor: threadbare jeans, a faded hoodie, and scuffed boots. He'd messed up his usually immaculate hair and left his designer watch and signet ring in his office safe. As he settled onto a bench along her regular route, his heart pounded with anticipation. He realized this was the first truly spontaneous thing he'd done in years. The cool morning air nipped at his exposed neck, so different from the climate-controlled comfort of his usual environments. Around him the park slowly came to life. Joggers in expensive athletic wear, office workers clutching takeaway coffee cups, dog walkers chatting about the day ahead. He felt invisible among them, and for the first time in his adult life, that invisibility felt like freedom. At 7:15 precisely, she appeared at the park entrance, her copper hair gleaming in the morning light. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as she approached, her worn blue coat fluttering in the breeze. Today, she carried a paper bag from a local bakery, and the same messenger bag hung heavy at her side. As she drew closer, he could see details he'd missed from his office window. The light dusting of freckles across her nose, the small scar above her right eyebrow, the way her eyes seemed to take in everything around her with genuine interest. She was even more beautiful up close. But it wasn't just her physical appearance that captivated him. It was the quiet dignity with which she carried herself despite her obviously modest circumstances. She was nearly level with his bench now. Alexander hunched his shoulders slightly, trying to embody the role he'd assigned himself. Would she notice him? Would she pass by without a glance, like so many others had done? The next few moments would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them could possibly know that yet. As the young woman approached Alexander's bench, she slowed her pace, and he could feel her eyes studying him. His heart raced beneath the worn hoodie. Would his disguise hold up to closer scrutiny? He kept his head down, but through his peripheral vision, he saw her reach into her paper bag. "Would you like to share my breakfast?" Her voice was gentle, with a slight northern accent that made her words dance. "The bakery always gives me too much, and it's much too lovely a morning to eat alone." Alexander looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. They were a striking shade of green, filled with kindness, but also with a hint of something deeper, perhaps sadness. He noticed dark circles beneath them, partially hidden by her attempt at makeup. "Thank you," he managed, trying to disguise his usual polished accent with something rougher. "That's very kind." She sat down beside him, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I'm Emma Wilson." She broke a croissant in half, offering him the larger portion. "I've just started taking this route to work, and I've noticed you here a few times." Alexander accepted the pastry, realizing she must have seen him on previous mornings when he'd been watching from his restaurant. "James," he said, using his financial advisor's name on impulse. "And what sort of work do you do, Emma?" "Oh, a bit of this and that," she replied, brushing crumbs from her coat. "Currently, I'm working as a delivery person for several restaurants in the area. It's flexible, which is important because—" She trailed off, then smiled. "Well, let's just say flexibility matters in my situation." As they ate, Emma told him about her favorite spots in the park: the bench near the duck pond where she liked to eat lunch, the ancient oak tree that seemed to change color before all the others in autumn, the spot where street musicians usually performed on weekends. Her observations were thoughtful and poetic, revealing a depth that drew Alexander in even further. "What about you?" she asked, gathering the paper bag and brushing off her hands. "Do you live nearby?" "No," he answered truthfully, "but I like it here. People are kinder in this park than in other places." He gestured to the croissant wrapper. "Case in point." Emma's smile widened, creating small dimples in her cheeks. "Everyone deserves a bit of kindness, don't they? Sometimes that's all it takes to change someone's whole day." She checked her watch, a simple digital model with a cracked face. "Oh, I should get going. My first delivery run starts at 8. As she stood, Alexander noticed her wince slightly, her hand moving to her lower back. The messenger bag looked heavy, and he wondered how many deliveries she made each day, cycling through London's busy streets. "Will you be here tomorrow?" The words tumbled out before he could stop them. Emma adjusted her bag, considering. "I usually pass through around this time. Maybe we could share breakfast again, if you'd like." There was a vulnerability in her question that tugged at his heart. "I'd like that very much," Alexander replied, trying to keep the eagerness from his voice. As he watched her walk away, her copper hair shining in the strengthening sunlight, Alexander felt a mix of elation and guilt. The connection he'd hoped for had sparked to life, but it was built on a deception. Still, there was something so genuine about Emma that made him want to be worthy of her trust, even if he had to earn it through an elaborate charade. The next few days fell into a pattern that Alexander began to treasure. Each morning, he would arrive early at their bench. He had already begun thinking of it as theirs, and Emma would appear at precisely 7:15, always carrying something to share. Their conversations flowed more easily now, though Alexander had to constantly guard against slipping back into his natural way of speaking. On this particular morning, dark clouds threatened rain, but Emma arrived as usual, this time with 2 paper cups of tea and a bag of freshly baked scones. "I hope you like Earl Grey," she said, settling beside him. "The cafe where I pick up my first deliveries started recognizing me, and they give me a discount now." She smiled proudly at this small victory. Alexander accepted the tea, noting how she had already added milk. She'd remembered from their previous conversation. "You didn't have to do this," he said softly. "Sometimes it's nice to do things we don't have to do," she replied, breaking a scone in half. "Besides, you looked cold yesterday. This weather isn't kind to people who—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed. "People who spend their days outside," he finished for her, fighting a smile. Her consideration for his supposed situation only made him admire her more. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the park came to life around them. A mother struggled past with a double pram, and Emma immediately jumped up to help her navigate the gate. Alexander watched her, marveling at how naturally kindness came to her. When she returned, she was rubbing her lower back again, a gesture he'd noticed becoming more frequent. "You're in pain," he observed. Emma waved off his concern. "It's nothing. Just carried too many heavy orders yesterday. The restaurants are getting busier with the colder weather coming in." She attempted a bright smile, but Alexander could see the strain behind it. "Why do you push yourself so hard?" he asked, then immediately worried he'd overstepped. Emma was quiet for a long moment, turning her paper cup in her hands. "My mom," she finally said, her voice soft. She's not well. The treatments are expensive, and our insurance doesn't cover everything. But she's all I have, and I'm all she has." She looked up at him, her green eyes fierce with determination. "So I do what needs to be done." Alexander felt his heart constrict. He thought of the state-of-the-art private medical facilities his family used, of the casual way he'd approved a 6-figure renovation for his restaurant's wine cellar just last week. The unfairness of it all struck him with physical force. "I'm sorry," he said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "It must be difficult, carrying that responsibility alone." "I'm not entirely alone," Emma replied, brightening slightly. "I have my friend Sarah. She's a nurse at the local clinic. She helps keep an eye on Mom when I'm doing my delivery runs. And now," she glanced at him shyly, "I have these morning talks to look forward to." The trust in her eyes made Alexander's guilt surge anew. He cleared his throat. "Tell me about your mom." Emma's face softened with love and worry. She was a teacher before she became ill, English literature. She can still quote entire passages from Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters. She's the one who taught me to love books, to see the beauty in words. She paused, lost in thought. Even now, when the pain keeps her awake, she'll recite poetry. Says it helps her forget for a while. A drop of rain landed on the bench between them, followed by another. Emma quickly gathered their breakfast remains, but before she could stand, Alexander noticed her shiver in her thin coat. "Here," he said, beginning to remove his hoodie. "Don't be silly," she protested. "You need it more than I do. I have deliveries to keep me warm, remember?" The rain was falling steadily now, and Emma pulled her messenger bag close to protect it. "I should go. The restaurants will be expecting their morning deliveries." She hesitated, then added, "James, would you like to come to my place for tea sometime? It's nothing fancy, just a small flat, but Mom would love the company. She doesn't get many visitors these days." Alexander felt simultaneously honored and terrified. To see Emma's home, to meet her mother, it would make his deception even more complex, but the hopeful look in her eyes made it impossible to refuse. "I'd like that," he heard himself say. "Tomorrow afternoon, around 4, I'll have finished my deliveries by then." She quickly wrote an address on a napkin. "It's not in the best area, but I'll be there," he promised. As he watched her hurry away through the rain, Alexander realized he had reached a turning point. Visiting Emma's home would take this beyond their morning conversations in the park. It would make everything more real and potentially more painful when the truth eventually came out. Back in his office, he found himself researching medical treatment options and insurance policies, his mind working on solutions he couldn't yet offer. James appeared with contracts requiring his signature, but Alexander could barely focus on them. "Sir," James ventured carefully, "the board is starting to ask questions about your reduced schedule." "Let them ask," Alexander replied, still staring at his computer screen. "James, what do you know about medical insurance coverage for chronic conditions?" His financial advisor looked surprised, but answered professionally. "It's complex territory, sir. Many treatments fall into grey areas of coverage. Why do you ask?" Alexander ignored the question. "And our company's charitable foundation. How quickly can we establish new initiatives?" "That would depend on the nature of the initiative, sir, and the board would need to approve any major new programs." Alexander nodded absently, already forming plans. He knew he was getting in deeper, letting his heart lead him into complicated territory. But as he thought of Emma's brave smile and her daily struggles, he realized he was past the point of turning back. Looking out his window at the rain-soaked park, he could almost see their morning scene played out again. Emma, sharing what little she had, fighting her battles with quiet dignity, while he sat there, accepting her kindness under false pretenses. Tomorrow, he would see her world up close, and the weight of his deception would either crush him or force him to find a way to make things right. The address Emma had given Alexander led him to a narrow street in one of London's less prosperous neighbourhoods. The Victorian-era building had seen better days, with peeling paint and a broken buzzer system. He hesitated at the entrance, conscious that he still tried to maintain some of his wealth in his appearance despite his disguise. Everything he wore was deliberately aged but still clean and intact. He checked the paper with Emma's address one more time. Flat 3B. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the worn stairs, the scent of various cooking spices from different flats mingling in the stairwell. When he reached Emma's door, he could hear soft classical music playing inside. Before he could knock, the door opened, and Emma's bright face greeted him. "James, I was watching for you from the window," she admitted with a slight blush. "Come in, please. Mind the step. It's a bit uneven." The flat was small but meticulously clean, with carefully patched furniture and walls decorated with framed book pages, beautiful illustrations from classic novels, he realized. A collection of well-worn paperbacks lined every available surface, and dried flowers hung in small bunches from a string across one wall, filling the space with a subtle, sweet fragrance. "It's not much," Emma said quickly, misreading his careful observation as judgment. "But it's home." "It's lovely," Alexander replied honestly, seeing how every corner reflected care and creativity, despite the obvious limitations of their budget. A soft wool blanket was draped over a threadbare sofa, and hand-painted teacups sat on a tray, ready for their visit. "Mum's having a good day today," Emma whispered, leading him toward a small sitting area. "She's been looking forward to meeting you. I hope you don't mind, but I've told her about our morning talks." In a worn but comfortable-looking armchair sat a woman who could only be Emma's mother. She had the same copper-coloured hair, though hers was streaked with grey, and identical green eyes that lit up as they entered. Despite her obvious frailty, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that reminded Alexander of her daughter. "So this is the young man who's been sharing my daughter's breakfast," she said warmly, extending a thin hand. "I'm Margaret Wilson, but please call me Maggie. Emma tells me you appreciate literature." Alexander took her hand gently, noting how Emma had mentioned their conversations about books. "Yes, ma'am, though I'm afraid my knowledge isn't as extensive as I'd like." "Nonsense," Maggie replied, gesturing for him to sit. "Emma says you quoted Shakespeare the other morning. The quality of mercy is not strained, wasn't it?" Alexander remembered the quote. He'd used it when they discussed kindness to strangers. He sat carefully on the offered chair, watching as Emma bustled about with the tea things, her movements betraying a slight stiffness from her morning deliveries. "Let me help," he offered, rising, but both women waved him back down. "Guests don't serve tea in this house," Maggie declared firmly, though her eyes twinkled. "Now tell me, what's your favorite Shakespearean play?" As they talked, Alexander found himself relaxing despite his guilt. Maggie was clearly well-educated and quick-witted, and he had to be careful not to let his own extensive education show too much in their literary discussion. He watched as Emma served the tea in the painted cups, noting how she discreetly helped her mother hold her cup steady. "Emma painted these herself," Maggie said proudly, holding up her teacup to show the delicate flowers adorning it. "She has quite the artistic talent, though she doesn't have much time for it these days." "Mom," Emma protested softly, but Alexander could see the pleasure in her eyes at her mother's praise. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander began to notice things that Emma had tried to hide during their morning meetings. The way she would massage her mother's hands when she thought no one was watching. The careful rationing of their tea and biscuits. The medical supplies partially visible through a partially open door. A half-empty pill bottle sat on a side table, its label bearing an expensive brand name he recognized from his company's pharmaceutical investments. "Would you excuse me for a moment?" Emma said, glancing at her watch. "It's time for Mum's medication." As she left the room, Maggie's face grew serious. "You seem like a kind young man," she said softly, "and I can see how you look at my daughter." Alexander felt his face warm. "Mrs. Wilson." "Maggie," she corrected gently. "Emma has had to grow up too quickly, take on too much responsibility. She thinks I don't know how many extra delivery shifts she takes, how she skips meals to make sure I have enough." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. A mother shouldn't have to watch her child sacrifice everything. Before Alexander could respond, Emma returned with a small pill cup and a glass of water. He watched as she helped her mother take the medication, her movements gentle and practiced. The moment crystallized everything for him. Emma's daily struggles, her quiet strength, the weight she carried alone. "I should probably go," he said, standing. "Thank you for having me." "You'll come again?" Maggie asked, and he could hear the hope in her voice, not just for herself, but for her daughter. "If I'm welcome," he replied, looking at Emma. "Of course you are," Emma said, walking him to the door. In the narrow hallway, she turned to face him. "Thank you for coming. It means a lot to Mom to have someone new to talk to about books. Sometimes I think she misses teaching more than anything." Alexander wanted to reach out, to pull her close, to tell her everything. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you for sharing your home with me." As he walked back through the darkening streets, his chauffeur-driven car waiting discreetly around the corner, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't continue this deception much longer, but before he revealed the truth, he needed to find a way to ensure Emma and her mother would be taken care of, regardless of how Emma might react to learning his true identity. The weight of their trust, their kindness, their quiet dignity in the face of such challenges, it all pressed against his conscience. He had entered their lives pretending to have nothing, while in reality he had everything they needed. The irony was unbearable. The following morning, Alexander arrived at his office hours before sunrise. He had barely slept, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. James found him surrounded by papers, his laptop open to medical research sites. "James," Alexander said without looking up, "I need you to set up a meeting with our insurance provider. Also, contact the board of the Montgomery Foundation. Tell them I want to propose a new healthcare initiative." "Of course, sir." James hesitated. May I ask if this has something to do with your morning arrangements? Alexander finally looked up, his expression determined. I need to help them, James. But I need to do it in a way that can't be traced back to me. Not yet. The next few hours were a flurry of discreet phone calls and careful arrangements. By the time Alexander changed into his worn clothes and headed to the park, he had set several plans in motion. Emma was already at their bench when he arrived, looking more tired than usual. I wasn't sure you'd come today, she said softly. Why wouldn't I? He asked, sitting beside her. She shrugged, picking at the paper bag in her hands. Some people, well, they treat you differently when they see you're struggling, as if poverty is contagious. Is that why you work so hard to hide it? Emma looked surprised at his perception. I suppose I do, don't I? It's silly, really. Everyone in our building knows. All the delivery companies know I'll take any extra shift they offer. But somehow, out here, in the park, she gestured at the manicured gardens around them. It's like I can pretend to be someone else for a little while. The irony of her words wasn't lost on Alexander. There's nothing wrong with who you are, Emma. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Tell that to the pharmacist who looks down his nose at us when we can't afford all of Mom's prescriptions, or the landlord who's threatening to increase our rent again. She took a deep breath. I'm sorry. I shouldn't burden you with all this. You can tell me anything, Alexander said, meaning it more than she could know. They shared the banana bread she had brought, and Emma told him about her mother's improving spirits after his visit. She's been quoting The Merchant of Venice all evening. I think she's trying to hint that she wants you to come back, Emma said with a small smile. I'd like that, Alexander replied, already planning how to balance his growing involvement in their lives with his other responsibilities. Later that day, in his office, Alexander received the news he'd been waiting for. The Montgomery Foundation had approved his proposal for a new healthcare initiative, one that would randomly select recipients for comprehensive medical coverage. He had carefully structured it to ensure Emma's mother would qualify without raising suspicions. The paperwork will be delivered to their flat tomorrow, James reported. It will appear to be part of a general outreach program in their neighborhood. Good, Alexander said, satisfied but still restless. And the rental company? Purchased through our shell corporation, sir. The building's ownership has been transferred, and the new management company will be informing all tenants of a rent reduction, citing community development initiatives. Alexander nodded, his mind still heavy with thoughts. These were just temporary solutions, band-aids on a deeper wound. He knew he needed to tell Emma the truth, but each day that passed made it harder. Each morning conversation, each shared smile, each small confidence made the potential of losing her more unbearable. That evening, as he was preparing to leave his office, he saw Emma cycling past the restaurant, her messenger bag heavy with deliveries. Without thinking, he rushed downstairs and out onto the street, maintaining enough distance that she wouldn't notice him. He followed her route, watching as she navigated through traffic, made her deliveries, and collected her modest tips. At one point, she stopped to help an elderly woman cross the street, despite clearly being in the middle of a time-sensitive delivery. The woman tried to offer her a pound coin as thanks, but Emma gently refused, hurrying back to her bicycle with a wave. Alexander's chest tightened as he watched these small moments of grace. How many times had he passed people needing help without even noticing them? How many opportunities for kindness had he missed in his rush from one business meeting to another? As he walked back to his office, he made another decision. The next day, he would have his restaurant managers start offering free meals to delivery cyclists, citing a new company policy. It wasn't much, but it would ensure Emma and her colleagues would at least have proper meals during their long shifts. Back in his office, he found a note from his sister, Victoria. Mommy's charity gala is next week. Don't you dare try to skip it again, and please tell me you found a date who won't try to pitch their business ideas to our investors this time." Alexander set the note aside, his mind turning to Emma. In another world, he would proudly escort her to the gala, introduce her to his family, show them how real kindness and grace had nothing to do with social status or bank balances. Instead, he would have to maintain his double life a little longer, helping from the shadows while trying to find the courage to tell her the truth. That night, alone in his penthouse, Alexander pulled out the napkin with Emma's address, tracing the careful numbers she'd written. Tomorrow, she would receive notice of her lucky selection for the healthcare program. Tomorrow, her mother's medical care would be secured. Tomorrow, their rent would be reduced to a manageable level. But tomorrow, she would still not know who he really was. And that thought kept him awake long into the night. The next morning, Emma practically ran into the park, her face glowing with excitement despite the early hour. Before Alexander could even greet her, she threw her arms around him in an impulsive hug. "You'll never believe what happened," she exclaimed, then quickly stepped back, blushing at her own enthusiasm. "Sorry, I had to tell someone who would understand." Alexander's heart raced, both from her unexpected embrace and the knowledge of what was coming. "What happened?" Emma sat beside him, pulling out several official-looking letters from her bag. "It's like some sort of miracle, James. First, we received this notice that Mum's been selected for a complete healthcare coverage program through some new foundation. All her treatments, medications, everything covered." She looked at him, her green eyes shining with happy tears. "Can you believe it? Just yesterday I was complaining about these exact things, and now—" She shook her head in wonder. "Sarah, my nurse friend, says she's never seen anything like this healthcare program. She's checking into it to make sure it's legitimate, but all the paperwork looks real." Alexander forced himself to maintain a neutral expression. "That's wonderful news, Emma. Your mother must be thrilled." "She's still in shock, I think." "We both are." Emma wiped her eyes, laughing softly. "I kept reading the letters over and over last night, afraid they'd disappear if I looked away. And there's more. The restaurants I deliver for have started offering free meals to all delivery workers. Real, proper meals, not just leftover bits." She took his hand impulsively, and Alexander felt his guilt war with the joy of her touch. "I know it probably sounds silly to be so excited about these things, but it's like suddenly being able to breathe after holding your breath for so long." "It doesn't sound silly at all," he said softly, squeezing her hand. Emma looked out across the park, her expression thoughtful. "You know what's strange? Just last week, Mum was reading Jane Eyre again, the part where Jane suddenly inherits money from her uncle. She said, 'Sometimes life surprises you with exactly what you need, just when you need it most.'" She turned back to him, her smile radiant. "I didn't really believe in things like that before. But now—" Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. Every bit of joy on her face was due to his actions, yet she had no idea. Was he any better than the wealthy benefactors she probably imagined behind these changes, using money to shape her life without her knowledge or consent? "You deserve good things, Emma," he said carefully. "You and your mother both." She squeezed his hand once more before letting go. "You know what this means? I can cut back on some of my delivery shifts, maybe even take that art class at the community center Mom's been encouraging me to try." She looked at him shyly. Would you like to come with me sometime, to the art class?" The invitation caught him off guard. "I don't know if I'd be very good at art." "Neither do I," she laughed. "But that's not really the point, is it? It's about trying something new. Maybe making a mess, but enjoying it anyway." She stood up, stretching. "I should go. Fewer deliveries today, but they still need to be made. Will you think about the art class?" "I will," he promised, watching as she walked away with a lighter step than he'd ever seen. Back in his office, Alexander found himself unable to focus on work. James brought in reports requiring his attention, but his mind kept returning to Emma's joyful face, her spontaneous hug, the way her hand had felt in his. "Sir," James interrupted his thoughts, "your sister is here." Before Alexander could respond, Victoria Montgomery swept into the office, impeccably dressed and radiating impatience. "Really, Alex, you've been impossible to reach lately. The gala is in 3 days, and Mommy's beside herself wondering if you'll actually show up this time." "Of course I'll be there," Alexander replied distractedly. Victoria perched on the edge of his desk, studying him. "You seem different. James says you've been coming in early, leaving at odd hours. And what's this I hear about new charitable initiatives? Can't a man try to do some good in the world?" "Of course, darling. But usually you leave that sort of thing to Mommy and her committees." She narrowed her eyes. "There's someone, isn't there? James won't tell me anything, but I know that look." Alexander sighed, knowing his sister wouldn't let this go. "It's complicated, Vic. Isn't it always?" She softened slightly. "Just tell me she's not another social climber after the family fortune." "She's the exact opposite," Alexander said quietly. "She's the most genuine person I've ever met." Victoria raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. "Then why haven't we met her? Bring her to the gala." "I can't." Alexander stood, walking to his window. Below, delivery cyclists wove through traffic, and he wondered if Emma was among them. "She doesn't exactly know who I am." "What do you mean she doesn't?" Victoria's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Alexander Montgomery, what have you done?" He told her everything, the morning meetings, the disguise, the secret arrangements to help Emma and her mother. Victoria listened in uncharacteristic silence, her expression moving from shock to understanding to concern. "Oh, darling," she said when he finished, "you're in love with her, aren't you?" Alexander didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. "You have to tell her the truth," Victoria said gently, "before she finds out some other way. You know how small London's social circles can be." "I know," Alexander replied, still staring out the window. "But every time I think about telling her, I imagine losing those morning conversations, those honest smiles, the way she looks at me like I'm just me." Victoria stood, straightening her designer dress. "The longer you wait, the harder it will be. And Alex, the way you just described her, someone that genuine might surprise you with how she handles the truth." After his sister left, Alexander sat at his desk for a long time, thinking about Emma's joy over the mysterious changes in her life, about her invitation to the art class, about the way she'd hugged him without hesitation. The line between his two lives was beginning to blur, and he knew Victoria was right. He needed to tell Emma the truth before fate forced his hand. But first, he had a gala to attend, and decisions to make about how to bridge the gap between Emma's world and his own. The night of the Montgomery Foundation's annual charity gala arrived with all its usual pomp and circumstance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead in the grand ballroom of the Dorchester, illuminating London's elite as they mingled, each trying to outshine the other in designer evening wear and family jewels. Alexander stood at the edge of the crowd, tugging unconsciously at his bow tie. He'd barely slept the night before, his dreams filled with images of Emma finding out his true identity in the worst possible ways. The morning's meeting with her had been particularly difficult. She'd been so excited to tell him about her mother's first day of improved treatment under the new healthcare program. "Darling, stop hovering by the wall like a frightened schoolboy." His mother, Beatrice Montgomery, appeared at his side in a shimmer of diamonds and silver silk. "The Harrington Smiths have been asking about you all evening. Their daughter just returned from finishing school in Switzerland." "Mother, please," Alexander interrupted gently. I'm not interested in any matchmaking tonight. Beatrice studied her son carefully. Victoria mentioned you've been different lately, more involved in the foundation work. She seems to think there might be someone. Before Alexander could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. A catering server had apparently tripped, sending a tray of champagne glasses crashing to the marble floor. As staff rushed to clean up the mess, Alexander's heart stopped. There, helping to pick up broken glass, was Sarah, Emma's nurse friend. He remembered Emma mentioning that Sarah sometimes picked up extra shifts with catering companies, but of all the events in London tonight. "Excuse me, Mother," he muttered, quickly making his way across the room. But before he could reach Sarah, Victoria intercepted him. "Alex, you need to see this," she said urgently, pulling him toward a display of the Foundation's new initiatives. There, prominently featured on a large screen, was a photo of him at last month's board meeting, alongside details of the very healthcare program that was now helping Emma's mother. "They've been showing this presentation all evening," Victoria explained. "If Sarah sees it—" Alexander's mind raced. Sarah was intelligent and observant. She would certainly make the connection between the mysterious James from the park and Alexander Montgomery, especially given the timing of the healthcare program's implementation. "I need to tell Emma first," he said firmly. "She can't find out like this." Victoria nodded. "Go. I'll run interference with Mother and make sure Sarah is kept busy in the kitchen area." Alexander slipped out of the ballroom, pulling out his, phone. It was nearly 10. Would Emma still be awake? He had memorized her number from the healthcare application but had never used it. As he debated what to do, fate intervened. "Mr. Montgomery?" He turned to find Sarah standing in the service corridor, her eyes wide with recognition. She was holding her phone, and on its screen was a photo Emma had just sent her, a selfie with James from their morning meeting. "Sarah, I can explain," he began. "Explain what?" Sarah's voice was cold. "How you've been pretending to be homeless while secretly running the foundation that's helping Margaret. How you've been playing with Emma's feelings." "It's not like that," Alexander protested. "I never meant to deceive her. I wanted her to know me as myself, not my money." "And how's that working out?" Sarah challenged. "Because from where I'm standing, you've been lying to my best friend for weeks, manipulating her life from the shadows like some sort of charitable puppet master." Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow, because he knew she was right. "I love her," he said quietly. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Then you know what you have to do." "I need to tell her tonight," he agreed. "But please, let me be the one to do it. She deserves to hear it from me." Sarah considered this for a moment. "You have until tomorrow morning. If you haven't told her by then, I will. She's been through too much to be toyed with." "I understand." Alexander checked his watch. "Will she still be awake?" "She just texted me that she's doing some late-night painting. The art class you secretly arranged is giving her so much joy," Sarah added pointedly. Alexander winced at the reminder of his well-intentioned manipulations. "Thank you, Sarah, for giving me this chance." "I'm not doing it for you," she replied. "I'm doing it for Emma. But Mr. Montgomery, if you hurt her—" "I know," he said softly. "I've been hurting her already by lying, haven't I?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Alexander turned to leave, then paused. "The healthcare program. It's real, and it's permanent. No matter what happens with Emma and me, please make sure she knows that won't change." As he rushed out of the hotel, he could feel Sarah's eyes on his back. His mother would be furious at his disappearance. The society pages would buzz with speculation. But none of that mattered now. He had to reach Emma before his carefully constructed world of deception came crashing down around them both. In his car, Alexander finally did what he should have done weeks ago. He pulled out his phone and dialed Emma's number, praying she would answer and agree to see him. The city lights blurred past his window as his driver headed toward her neighborhood, and Alexander rehearsed what he would say, knowing no words could truly prepare either of them for what was to come. Emma was surprised to receive a call so late at night, especially from an unknown number. She was even more surprised to hear the familiar voice on the other end. "James," she asked cautiously. "I need to see you," Alexander said, his voice tight with emotion. "Please, Emma, it's important." "Now? Is everything all right?" She glanced at her paint-stained hands and the half-finished canvas before her. "It has to be tonight," Alexander said. After a pause, she relented. "All right. The community garden near my flat. 20 minutes." The small community garden was quiet in the cool night air, the scent of damp earth and flowers hanging in the breeze. Emma stood waiting, her old blue coat wrapped tightly around her against the chill. She didn't know why she felt uneasy, but something about James's tone on the phone had unsettled her. When she saw him approaching, her heart sank. He looked completely different. His usual worn hoodie and scuffed boots replaced by an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was styled, his posture straighter, more confident. This wasn't the James she thought she knew. "Who are you?" The question escaped her lips before he even reached her. Alexander stopped a few feet away, his face drawn with anxiety. "My name is Alexander Montgomery," he said softly. "I'm the CEO of Montgomery Restaurants and the chairman of the Montgomery Foundation." He hesitated. "The foundation that's providing your mother's healthcare coverage." Emma's world tilted. Memories flashed through her mind, every morning conversation, every shared moment, every vulnerable story she'd told him. "You're—" her voice cracked. "You're the one behind everything, aren't you? The rent reduction, the free meals for delivery workers, the art class sponsorship, all of it." Alexander nodded, taking a cautious step toward her. "Yes, but I can explain." "Explain what?" Emma's voice rose, trembling with anger. "That you lied to me? That you let me believe you were someone else while you played God with my life?" "I never meant to hurt you," Alexander said desperately. "That first morning, when I saw you in the park, sharing your breakfast with that elderly man, I realized I'd never seen such genuine kindness. I wanted to know you, the real you, not the person you might pretend to be for someone like me. So you decided to pretend to be someone else instead?" Emma's laugh was bitter. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? All those mornings I worried about you being cold or hungry, and all along you were—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Your kindness was real," Alexander said quickly. "Everything we shared was real. My feelings for you are real." "Real." Emma's voice was icy. "I told you things, James. No, Alexander, things I wouldn't have shared if I'd known who you really were. I felt guilty for complaining about my problems to someone I thought had so much less than me." "And all the while you were sitting there, what? Conducting some kind of social experiment? No. Emma, please listen to me." Alexander's voice cracked with emotion. "I fell in love with you. I know I went about it the wrong way, but my feelings for you are genuine. Love doesn't manipulate. Love doesn't deceive." Emma's voice was quieter now, but the pain in her eyes cut deeper than her words. "You played God with our lives, arranging everything from behind the scenes like some sort of charitable puppet master." Alexander flinched. Her words echoed Sarah's earlier accusation, and he couldn't deny their truth. "I was trying to help," he said softly. Emma turned away from him, her shoulders tense. "We didn't need a savior, Alexander. We needed honesty, respect." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. In the distance, a siren wailed, and Emma thought absurdly of all the deliveries she'd made to restaurants like his, never knowing she was serving his empire. "I should have told you sooner," Alexander finally said. "I tried so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing the connection we had. Afraid you'd look at me differently." "Well, you were right about that," Emma said tiredly. "I am looking at you differently. Not because you're rich, but because you're a liar." "Emma, please." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "I need you to leave," she said firmly, her voice trembling with suppressed tears. "I need time to think, to process all of this, and I need you to respect that. Can you do that, just one honest thing for me?" Alexander's hand fell to his side. "Yes," he said softly. "Of course." He took a step back, then stopped. "But Emma, everything I feel for you is real, and if you'll let me, I'll spend as long as it takes proving that to you." Emma didn't turn around, didn't answer. She waited until she heard his footsteps retreat, until she heard the soft purr of an expensive car engine starting up. Only then did she allow herself to sink onto a nearby bench, her body shaking with sobs. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A message from Sarah. "Are you okay? Call me if you need me." Emma stared at the message, realization dawning. "You knew," she whispered to herself. "You found out tonight and made him tell me." The night air had grown colder, but Emma barely noticed. Her mind was spinning with revelations, with memories suddenly cast in a new light. Every morning conversation, every shared smile, every moment of connection, all of it touched by this new knowledge. Above her, the moon emerged from behind a cloud, illuminating the small garden where her world had just turned upside down. The morning after Alexander's revelation, Emma didn't go to the park. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed too bright, too ordinary for a world that had shifted so dramatically. "Darling," Maggie's voice came from the doorway, gentle but knowing. "Sarah called. She told me everything." Emma looked up at her mother, expecting to see disappointment or anger. Instead, she found understanding in those familiar green eyes. "Why aren't you more upset about this?" Emma asked, her voice shaky. "He manipulated us, arranged everything from behind the scenes like we were characters in his personal charity story." Maggie made her way carefully to the table, settling into a chair beside her daughter. Her movements were steadier now thanks to the new treatments that Emma reminded herself bitterly had come from Alexander's intervention. "Do you remember what I always taught you about Jane Austen's novels?" Maggie asked, reaching for Emma's hand. "How the truth of a person lies not in their circumstances, but in their choices." "Mom, please," Emma said, shaking her head. "Don't turn this into a literature lesson." "Just hear me out," Maggie insisted gently. "Yes, Alexander deceived us about his identity. But think about his choices. He could have simply written a check or had his foundation help anonymously. Instead, he chose to spend his mornings on a cold park bench, getting to know you, learning about our lives, understanding our struggles. While lying about everything, Emma pointed out, her voice tight. "Not everything," Maggie corrected. "I've seen how he looks at you, Emma. That's not something anyone can fake." Before Emma could respond, there was a knock at the door. Sarah entered, still wearing her catering uniform from the previous night. She wrapped Emma in a tight hug before pulling up a chair. "I'm so sorry I couldn't warn you," Sarah said, "but I thought you needed to hear it from him." Emma nodded, grateful for her friend's wisdom. "Tell me about last night. About how you found out." Sarah described the charity gala, the foundation's presentation, and her confrontation with Alexander in the service corridor. "He left immediately to find you, Emma," Sarah said. "Abandoned his family's biggest social event of the year in the middle of it. The society pages are probably having a field day." "Good," Emma muttered, though her voice lacked venom. "He's not what I expected," Sarah admitted. "When I realized who he was, I thought he'd be, I don't know, condescending, defensive. Instead, he seemed genuinely tortured about deceiving you. and he made sure to tell me that your mother's healthcare wouldn't be affected no matter what." Emma stood abruptly, walking to the window. The view was the same as always, the cramped street, the worn buildings, the small shops opening for the day. But now she knew that their reduced rent, the building's promised improvements, even the new community programs in the area, were all part of Alexander's hidden influence. "I feel like I don't know what's real anymore," she confessed. "Every good thing that's happened lately has his fingerprints on it. Even my art classes." "The art is real," Maggie said firmly. "The talent is yours, Emma. He may have provided the opportunity, but what you're creating, that comes from you alone." Sarah joined Emma at the window. "He's outside, you know, has been since dawn." Emma's heart jumped. "What?" "Not too close," Sarah said. "He's respecting your request for space. But he's there, sitting in his car, just waiting." Emma peered out, and sure enough, she could see the sleek black car parked at the corner. Even from this distance, she could make out Alexander's figure in the back seat, his posture tense and alert. "The worst part," Emma said softly, "is that I miss him. The him I knew, or thought I knew. This morning was the first time in weeks I haven't shared breakfast with him, and it feels wrong." "Maybe because not everything was a lie," Maggie suggested. "The conversations you shared, the connection you formed, perhaps those were more real than the deception. But how can I trust him?" Emma turned to face her mother and Sarah. "How can I believe anything when it started with such a huge lie?" "The same way you believe in second chances," Maggie replied. "The same way you taught me to believe in hope when my illness seemed hopeless, by looking at actions, not just words." Sarah nodded, and his actions, manipulative as they may have been, were aimed at helping others. "The healthcare program isn't just for your mum. Dozens of families in similar situations are benefiting. The reduced rent applies to everyone in the building. The free meals help all delivery workers." Emma sank back into her chair, feeling drained. "I need time to sort through all of this, to figure out what's real and what isn't." "Of course you do," Maggie agreed. "But don't let pride or anger blind you to the possibility of forgiveness, not for his sake, but for yours." "And maybe," Sarah added with a small smile, "consider that it takes a special kind of person to choose sitting on a cold park bench, sharing modest breakfasts, over enjoying his millionaire lifestyle, just to know the real you." Emma's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I understand if you never want to see me again, but I'll be at our bench every morning. Same time, same place. No more disguises, no more lies. Just me, hoping for a chance to show you who I really am." She stared at the message, feeling tears prick at her eyes again. Through the window she could see Alexander's car, still waiting patiently, like its owner, for a sign of hope. "What should I do?" she whispered, not sure if she was asking her mother, Sarah, or herself. Maggie squeezed her hand. "What does your heart tell you?" Emma looked down at the message again, then out at the waiting car, then at her mother's improving face and Sarah's concerned expression. The truth, she realized, was as complicated as the man who had hidden it for so long. For a week, Emma avoided the park entirely, taking different routes to her deliveries. But she couldn't avoid the news. Alexander Montgomery's face seemed to be everywhere. In newspapers discussing his foundation's new healthcare initiative, in business magazines praising his company's progressive employment policies, and in gossip columns speculating about his sudden interest in their modest neighborhood. One morning, unable to sleep, Emma found herself scrolling through articles about him on her phone. The Alexander Montgomery of the press was both familiar and foreign. She recognized his kind eyes and warm smile in the photos, but the confident business titan in designer suits seemed worlds away from the man who had shared her morning pastries. "You're up early," Maggie observed, finding Emma on the sofa with her phone. "The articles again," Emma said, locking her screen quickly, embarrassed. "Understanding comes from talking, not reading," Maggie said wisely, settling beside her. Sarah told me he's still there every morning. Same bench, same time. I know. Emma had secretly checked a few times, watching from a distance as Alexander sat alone on their bench. He no longer wore his disguise, but he looked more vulnerable in his tailored suits than he ever had in his worn hoodie. He sent these yesterday, Maggie continued, holding up a stack of books. First editions of the classics we discussed that afternoon. There's a note saying they're for your public library project. Emma took the books, running her fingers over their beautiful leather bindings. Inside each one, instead of a personal inscription, she found a bookplate that read, "Donated to the community in honor of Margaret Wilson, former teacher and lifelong advocate of literature." "He's trying," Maggie said softly, "in his own way." Later that day, during her delivery shift, Emma found herself approaching the Crown and Crescent, Alexander's restaurant, where everything had begun. She'd avoided this area for the past week, but today, something drew her closer. Through the window, she could see his office, where he had first watched her pass by. It was empty now, but a familiar figure stood in the restaurant's doorway. James, the financial advisor who had unknowingly lent his name to Alexander's deception. "Miss Wilson," he called out politely as she passed. "A moment, please." Emma hesitated, then wheeled her bike over. "Yes?" "He's not here," James assured her quickly. "He's been working from home this week, but, well, I feel somewhat responsible, having unknowingly contributed to the situation." "It's not your fault. He used your name." James smiled sadly. "Perhaps not, but I've worked for Alexander for 10 years and I've never seen him like this. Do you know he's completely restructured our corporate giving program? Every initiative now requires direct community involvement from our executives. They can't just write checks anymore. They have to spend time understanding the needs of the people they're trying to help." Emma absorbed this information, thinking of Alexander sitting on their bench all those mornings, learning about her world firsthand. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the man you met in the park, that's the real Alexander Montgomery. The one I've always known was there underneath all the corporate responsibilities and social expectations." James hesitated. "The board thinks he's having some sort of crisis, but I think he's finally found his purpose." That evening, Emma sat in the community garden where Alexander had revealed the truth. She sketched in her notebook, her art classes continuing, now funded by a proper community education grant that Sarah had verified was legitimate and available to anyone in the neighborhood. A message buzzed on her phone, another from Alexander's number. "The autumn art exhibition at the community center is being announced tomorrow. Your art teacher submitted your work for consideration. I had nothing to do with the selection process, I promise, but I've seen your paintings at the center, and they're beautiful. You have a real gift." Emma stared at his words, feeling tears prick at her eyes again. Another message followed. "I'm still at our bench every morning. No more disguises, no more lies. Just me, hoping for a chance to show you who I really am." The next morning, Emma woke before dawn. She lay in bed for a long time, listening to the city come to life outside her window. Finally, she got up, dressed, and walked to the little bakery where she'd bought breakfast for them so many times. "The usual?" the baker asked with a knowing smile. Emma nodded, accepting the paper bag and 2 cups of tea. Her hands shook slightly as she paid. The park was quiet at this hour, the early morning mist still clinging to the grass. As she approached their bench, she saw him. Alexander was dressed in an expensive suit but looked somehow rumpled, as if he hadn't slept well. He was staring at his hands, lost in thought. Emma took a deep breath and walked forward. Alexander looked up at the sound of her footsteps, hope and fear warring on his face. She stopped a few feet away. "The thing is," she said quietly, "I miss our conversations." "I miss them too," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "More than anything." Emma held up the paper bag. "I brought breakfast, but I have conditions." "Anything?" Alexander said quickly, then caught himself. Sorry, I'm listening. No more lies, no more manipulating things from behind the scenes. And if we try to move forward, it has to be as equals. I don't need a savior or a benefactor. I need someone who sees me for who I am. I do see you, Emma, Alexander said softly. I always have. He gestured to the space beside him on the bench. That's why I came here every morning, why I shed all the trappings of my other life, because you saw me too, the real me underneath it all. Emma sat down, leaving space between them. She pulled out the tea and pastries, the familiar ritual both comforting and strange in this new context. I can't promise this will work, she warned. I'm still angry and hurt and confused. I know, Alexander said softly. But can I tell you something? As myself this time? Emma nodded. That first morning, when you shared your breakfast with me, no one had shown me that kind of simple kindness in years. Everything in my life had become about transactions and expectations. You reminded me what it means to be human. Emma sipped her tea, letting his words sink in. The quiet of the park wrapped around them, the distant hum of the city providing a steady backdrop to their fragile conversation. I don't know if I can trust you again, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, his expression heavy with understanding. I'll spend as long as it takes earning that trust, Emma. And if that means just sitting here every morning with you, sharing tea and pastries, then that's what I'll do. She studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of insincerity. What she saw instead was vulnerability, something she hadn't expected from a man with so much power and influence. Why did you choose me? She asked finally. Of all the people you could have met, why me? Alexander smiled faintly. It wasn't a choice, really. It was you who chose me. That first morning, you didn't walk past me. You didn't ignore me. You stopped, shared what little you had, and treated me like a person, not a stranger, not a burden. I hadn't felt that seen in years. Emma looked down at the paper bag in her lap, her fingers tracing the folds absent-mindedly. I'm not sure what I feel right now, she confessed. You don't have to decide anything, Alexander said gently. I just want to be here. No expectations, no pressure. For a while they sat in silence, sipping their tea and watching the park come alive with its usual morning activity. Joggers passed by, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. I saw the books you sent my mum, Emma said eventually. She loves them. I'm glad, Alexander replied. Your mother's passion for literature reminded me of why I loved it in the first place. Those books belong in the hands of people who truly appreciate them. She told me I should give you a second chance, Emma admitted. Alexander turned to her, his eyes hopeful. And what do you think? I think second chances have to be earned, she said firmly. But maybe I'm willing to let you try. In the weeks that followed, their routine slowly returned, though it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Alexander was true to his word, making no attempts to intervene in her life beyond their shared mornings. Emma found herself relaxing again, laughing at his self-deprecating stories about his board meetings and the awkward attempts he was making to connect with his employees on a more personal level. One morning, he arrived with a paintbrush tucked into his suit pocket. What's that for? Emma asked, raising an eyebrow. I thought maybe you could teach me, Alexander said, holding it out to her. You know art. I'm terrible at it, but I'd like to try. Emma couldn't help but laugh. You, painting. Aren't you afraid of ruining that fancy suit? Completely terrified, he admitted with a grin. But I figure, if you can be brave enough to share your work at the community center's art exhibition, I can be brave enough to learn how to hold a brush properly. Emma felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She still wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of strangers viewing her art, but her teacher had insisted her pieces deserved to be seen. "Fine," she said, taking the brush, "but don't blame me if you end up with paint stains that even your dry cleaner can't fix." "Deal," Alexander said, his smile wide and genuine. The exhibition at the community centre was modest but bustling with local talent and attendees. Emma's paintings were displayed in a small corner, their vibrant colours and intricate details drawing a steady stream of admirers. Alexander arrived early, dressed simply in a sweater and jeans, and spent the evening quietly watching Emma interact with visitors. She seemed both nervous and exhilarated, her passion for art shining through in every conversation. When the evening wound down, Alexander approached her, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "You're incredible," he said simply, handing her a glass. Emma smiled, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "It's been a good night." As they stood together, the community centre buzzing with laughter and conversation, Emma felt something shift. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was something close. A step forward. "Thank you for being here," she said softly. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," Alexander replied, his voice steady with sincerity. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, Emma began to rebuild the trust that had been fractured. Alexander proved himself through actions rather than words, respecting her independence and supporting her from a distance when she needed it. One chilly autumn morning, as they sat on their bench with cups of steaming tea, Emma turned to him. "Do you still believe in second chances?" she asked, her tone teasing but with an undercurrent of seriousness. Alexander looked at her, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I believe in earning them," he said. "Every single day." Emma smiled, leaning slightly closer. "Good, because I think you've earned yours." The winter months brought a new rhythm to Emma and Alexander's lives. Their mornings in the park became a cornerstone of their relationship, a place where they could escape the complexities of the outside world and just be themselves. Alexander had completely integrated into Emma's life, not as a benefactor or a powerful businessman, but as a partner who genuinely cared about her passions and struggles. He accompanied her to art supply shops, helped hang her latest pieces at the community centre, and even volunteered during local events, much to the amusement of Emma's friends. One evening, as they walked back to her flat after a community dinner, Alexander stopped suddenly, taking her hand. "I want to show you something," he said, his voice serious. Emma raised an eyebrow. "Now, it's freezing, and we're miles from anywhere warm." "It won't take long, I promise," Alexander replied, leading her down a side street. They arrived at a small, unassuming building with a for-lease sign still taped to the window. Alexander unlocked the door, gesturing for Emma to step inside. The space was empty but full of potential, brightly lit with wide open walls and a lofted ceiling. Emma turned to him, confused. "What is this?" "It's yours," Alexander said simply. Emma blinked, taking a step back. "What do you mean, mine?" "I bought the lease," he explained, his voice gentle. "For you, to use as a studio, gallery, or whatever you want. It's completely yours, no strings attached. I made sure the paperwork is in your name." Emma's emotions swirled. Awe, gratitude, and a lingering hesitation. "Alexander," she began, but he cut her off. "I know what you're thinking," he said, "that this is too much, or that I'm overstepping again. But Emma, I've seen how your art has brought joy to so many people, how it's given you purpose and hope. I want to give you a space where you can share that with the world, on your terms." Emma looked around the room, imagining it filled with her paintings, with people stopping by to admire her work. For the first time, the idea of pursuing her passion full-time didn't seem like an impossible dream. "It's beautiful," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "but I need time to think about this." "Take all the time you need," Alexander replied. The lease is yours whether you decide to use it tomorrow or 10 years from now. I just want you to have the opportunity. Over the following weeks, Emma visited the space often, letting the idea settle. She spoke to Sarah, her mother, and her art teacher, all of whom encouraged her to take the leap. Finally, on a snowy evening in December, Emma met Alexander at their bench, clutching a small envelope in her gloved hands. "I've made my decision," she said, handing him the envelope. Inside was a photograph of her first painting to hang in the new studio, a vibrant, abstract piece inspired by the mornings they had shared in the park. "I'm going to do it," Emma said, her smile radiant. "And I want you to be there on opening night." Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. The opening night of Emma's gallery was a resounding success. The space was filled with friends, family, and members of the community who had followed her journey. Even some of Alexander's colleagues attended, eager to support the woman who had clearly captured his heart. As the evening wound down, Emma stood by Alexander's side, watching the last guests leave. "You've given me so much," she said, her voice soft, "more than I could ever repay." "You've already repaid me," Alexander replied, taking her hand. "You've shown me what it means to live a life full of meaning, to see beauty in the little things, and to care deeply for others. That's worth more than anything I could ever give." Emma smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I guess we make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," Alexander said, wrapping an arm around her as they looked out at the city lights beyond the gallery windows. Together, they had found something more valuable than wealth or success, something real, something lasting. And it all began with a simple act of kindness in a park.